A single aircraft leaves the ground and doesn't touch down again for 19 straight uninterrupted hours. No stopover, no refueling, no second country in between. Just one long, continuous stretch of open sky between Singapore and New York. And by every normal rule of aviation, a flight that long simply shouldn't fly. Here's the problem nobody tells you about. The farther a plane flies, the more fuel it needs. But fuel itself is heavy, so the extra fuel you're carrying needs its own fuel just to stay airborne. Add 10 tons of jet fuel, and you're not adding 10 tons of range. You're adding maybe 7, because the other 3 just went toward hauling the first 7. Engineers have a name for this vicious cycle. They call it the tyranny of the fuel fraction. And it's the exact reason almost nothing on Earth can fly this far without breaking in half. Think of it like packing for a hike where the water you bring to hydrate yourself also has to be carried on your own back. Bring enough water for 3 days and your pack gets so heavy that you burn through calories faster, which means you now need more food, which adds more weight, which slows you down further. At some point, the math eats itself. That's exactly what happens to a jet trying to cross an ocean and a half without stopping. Every extra hour of range costs more than the hour before it, and eventually the curve gets so steep that adding fuel stops helping altogether. A plane can be so overloaded with the fuel it needs to fly far that it can no longer lift that fuel off the runway in the first place. So how does one plane pull it off? By cutting something most passengers would never expect. There's no economy cabin, not a shrunken one, not a squeezed one, none at all. Every single seat on this jet is either business class or premium economy, and that's not a branding decision, it's a weight decision. Fewer bodies, fewer meal trays, fewer seatback screens, all of it stripped out so the fuel tanks can win the argument. The aircraft making this possible is a heavily modified version of the Airbus A350, stretched internally to hold roughly a sixth more fuel than the standard model, without adding a single extra tank to the airframe. On this route, the jet burns through something like 85% of its total range capability before it ever sees the runway at the other end. That's not a comfortable cushion. That's flying right up against the edge of what the aircraft is physically rated to do, close enough that it's certified to divert more than 6 hours to the nearest airport if an engine ever failed somewhere over open ocean. This isn't even the first time someone tried this route. Back in the early 2000s, a different aircraft flew non-stop between these same two cities for almost a decade, until fuel prices climbed high enough to kill it outright. That older jet was burning nearly 40% more fuel per passenger than what replaced it years later. The math simply stopped working, and for 5 full years, nobody on the planet flew this route non-stop. It took a completely new generation of aircraft before the numbers finally lined back up. This particular carrier isn't the only one who has tried to chase records like this, and the graveyard of attempts is longer than most people realize. Other airlines have flown marathon non-stop routes for a few years at a time, only to quietly cancel them once oil prices climbed or once a slightly more efficient aircraft made the old math look foolish. Ultra long-haul flying has always been less about whether an aircraft can physically make the distance and more about whether an airline can keep justifying the cost of flying it that way every single day for years on end. A route like this can survive a bad quarter, maybe even a bad year if the airline is patient enough. It usually cannot survive a bad decade, and even now the plane doesn't fly the shortest line between the two cities. The most direct path would cut straight across Russian and Arctic airspace, closed off since 2022. So instead, eastbound and westbound flights loop around the globe in almost opposite directions, sometimes deliberately choosing a longer path because tailwinds at altitude burn less fuel overall than fighting a headwind on a shorter one. It's the same reason long-haul routes curve the way they do on a flight tracker instead of drawing a straight line across the map. Solving the aircraft turned out to be the easier half of this problem. The harder half is the human body sitting inside it for the better part of a full day. Cabin air holds only a fraction of the moisture your lungs are used to, so dehydration creeps in faster than it would on the ground. Oxygen saturation in your blood dips slightly at cruising altitude, which is a big part of why everyone feels foggier by hour 16 than they did an hour after takeoff. And your internal clock, the one regulating when your body wants to be awake or asleep, has absolutely no framework for crossing 12 time zones in one uninterrupted sitting. Airlines have started treating all of this less like a comfort problem and more like an engineering one. Cabin lighting on these ultra-long routes now shifts gradually through program cycles, timed to match the clock at your destination, not the one you took off from. Food gets complicated too. Low humidity and cabin pressure dull your ability to taste and smell by something like 30%, which is exactly why airline meals have traditionally leaned so heavily on salt, just to register on taste buds that stop working properly up there. Except loading up on sodium for 19 hours makes the dehydration and bloating worse, not better. So the carrier flying this route built its menu around a wellness retreat concept instead, leaning on lean proteins and hydration, with meals timed specifically to nudge your body clock toward the destination rather than the place you left. Multiple crews rotate through a flight this long, resting in hidden bunks tucked into a compartment above the ceiling panels that most passengers never even notice exists. There are usually 2 full sets of pilots on a flight like this, one flying while the other sleeps. Trading places every few hours so nobody is making split-second decisions on hour 17 of being awake. The cabin crew rotate the same way, working the aisles in shifts so there's always a rested set of hands available if something goes wrong at 3 in the morning body clock time, even if the sun outside the window says otherwise. And one airline actually studied what all of this does to a human brain in real time. Pilots wore EEG headsets for the full duration of research flights, recording brain activity minute by minute, while separate researchers tracked melatonin through urine samples collected before, during, and after each flight. What they found wasn't what anyone expected going in. Alertness didn't fade in a smooth, predictable slope. It dropped in waves tied directly to meal timing and cockpit workload. A pilot could report feeling completely fine 14 hours in, while the data underneath was telling researchers a very different story about what was actually happening in his brain. Which raises the obvious question, why go through all of this at all? Gutting an entire cabin class and flying an aircraft this close to its structural limit is expensive by any measure you want to use. But airlines aren't doing this to chase the passenger hunting for the cheapest fare on the internet. They're doing it for the traveler who will pay a real premium just to avoid landing somewhere in the middle and doing it all over again. And there are more of those travelers than you'd guess. Business flyers consistently pay more to skip a connection, even on routes where the layover barely adds any real time to the trip. On a journey this long, cutting out one stopover can save the better part of an entire day. And if someone else is footing the bill for that ticket, a saved day is worth serious money. A rival carrier already proved this pricing model works on its own marathon route between Australia and London, where passengers happily pay around a fifth more just to skip the one stop entirely. The airline behind tonight's story is doubling down on the same bet. Starting in 2027, this exact aircraft gets reconfigured yet again. Even fewer total seats, but a first-class cabin added for the first time, with the premium economy section shrinking further to make room for it. Fewer seats again in exchange for higher fares on whichever seats remain. Now compare that to cargo, because it exposes just how differently this same physics problem gets solved when there's no passenger on board to keep comfortable. One major freight carrier's main hub processes cargo jets capable of hauling close to 150 tons of payload at maximum weight. Except loaded that heavy, the aircraft's range collapses from over 8,000 nautical miles down to roughly half of that. A direct run from that hub to Hong Kong is well past 7,000 miles, meaning flying it non-stop, fully loaded, is simply off the table. So the carrier routes through Alaska instead, refueling and swapping crews mid-journey before continuing on. A shipping container doesn't care how long the trip takes. It doesn't get jet lagged, it doesn't need a lie-flat seat, and nobody is billing a client for the hours it spends sitting in a cargo hold over Alaska. A business traveler with an expense account very much cares, and that single difference in patience is what quietly shapes billions of dollars in how passenger airlines and freight operators design their entire route networks, right down to which cities get a direct flight and which ones are stuck connecting through a hub 3 time zones out of the way. Right now, 19 hours sits close to the practical ceiling of what a passenger jet can manage non-stop with anything flying today. There isn't much runway left to stretch this further without a fundamentally different aircraft. And the fragility underneath all of it isn't just theoretical either. Earlier this year, a conflict disrupting shipping and fuel supply near the Strait of Hormuz sent jet fuel prices spiking nearly 70% almost overnight, adding tens of billions of dollars to the industry's total fuel bill and roughly cutting projected global airline profits in half. Multiple carriers cut capacity within weeks of that spike. It's the same exact vulnerability that killed this route's first attempt back in the early 2000s, just replaying itself now on a global scale. And it isn't distributed evenly either. Airlines from countries still permitted to overfly Russian airspace get a genuine advantage in both fuel burn and total flight time that everyone else now has to route around entirely. And it isn't just fuel prices that can knock a route like this off balance. A single closed airspace corridor, a sudden spike in insurance costs for flying near a conflict zone, or one bad quarter of weaker demand can be enough to push a razor-thin route back into the red. There is very little margin for error left over when an aircraft is already flying at the outer limit of everything it was engineered to do, except one competing airline is already building for something even longer. That carrier passed on Boeing's still uncertified next-generation jet and instead chose a heavily modified version of the same Airbus platform for a route that will eventually stretch past 22 hours in the air, nearly a full day spent between 2 cities. The project has slipped its timeline more than once already, and it isn't expected to carry paying passengers until sometime in 2027. When it finally does, today's record holder is going to look almost conservative by comparison. There's a strange irony sitting underneath all of this. The industry keeps describing these ultra-long routes as triumphs of engineering, and in a lot of ways they are. But every single one of them is also a workaround, a patch applied on top of a fundamental limitation that hasn't actually gone away. Nobody has solved the fuel weight paradox. They've just found increasingly clever, increasingly expensive ways to dance right up against its edge without falling over it. A slightly lighter composite fuselage here, a slightly more efficient engine there, one fewer cabin class stripped out to buy back a few more tons of range. None of it eliminates the problem. It just moves the wall a little further down the runway. Every single time the fuel weight problem looks like a hard stop, somebody finds a way to push that line a little further out. 19 hours was supposed to be close to the absolute limit too. Right up until it wasn't. And somewhere on a test airfield right now, a new aircraft is already being quietly built to prove that same limit, wrong all over again, one more time.